Alright, what's up guys? Today we are reviewing the Gearbox Pro Ultimate Hyper. Sorry that this review is probably about a week late at this point. On launch date, I just didn't feel that my Gearbox had fully broken in yet, and I just didn't think it was right to do a full review at the time. But now I've gotten to spend more time with it. It's definitely broken in, so let's get right into it. As a quick disclosure, Gearbox did send these paddles to me for free, but they did not pay for this review, they did not influence this review, and all thoughts and opinions are my own. I do have an affiliate link down in the description that does help support the channel if you use it though. Before we get into the specs, I want to go over why this exists. The Pro Ultimate Elongated came out this summer, but it lacked in popularity due to the very high swing weight and high balance point combination. I had been working on a review of that paddle, but I just could not get over how heavy that paddle was to swing, and I think that sentiment was shared amongst a lot of people. So now the Hyper exists, which I think should have come out quite a while ago with the Pro Power back when it launched. Gearboxes have always been known for having a smaller sweet spot, so having a wide body that can get you faster hand speed and a larger sweet spot would have been killer for the Pro Power. So the Ultimate Hyper now exists to fill that role, which is faster hand speed and a much larger sweet spot than the former Ultimate. The Hyper can be purchased for $275, and there are no discount codes available for Gearbox paddles. I do have an affiliate link in the description that helps support the channel if you use it, but unfortunately it doesn't provide a discount. The other specs are as follows. It has a 5.5 inch handle length, 4 inch grip circumference, weighs 8 ounces, and has a core thickness of 16 millimeter with a raw carbon fiber face. The more important specs that you might care about from my unit are a swing weight of 113, balance point of 24.7 centimeter, and I know for many of you out there this balance point number hasn't been very well defined up to this point, but all you really need to know is that this balance point of 24.7 centimeter is on the very high end of balance points. If you take a look at my database of over 300 paddles, there are only 6 paddles with a balance point of 24.7 centimeter or higher. And of those 6 paddles, 4 of them are Gearbox paddles. The other 2 are PaddleTech TKO CXs. By no means would I call the new Hyper slow in the hand, but what I would say is that it feels noticeably more head heavy than other wide body paddles, especially ones with a similar swing weight. For ground strokes or block volleys at the net, most things felt fine. The only shot that felt noticeably harder was flicks. I just couldn't generate the head speed that I normally can. So keep that in mind if you are sensitive to head heavy paddles. The other 2 notable numbers are twist weight and RPM. The twist weight on my unit was 6.32, which isn't that large of a number on average. However, it is a very large increase for Gearbox paddles, which have historically been in the low 5s, and in some cases even below 5. 6.32 is also a higher number given that this is an edgeless paddle. Most edgeless paddles have a very low twist weight, but we'll cover the sweet spot performance more throughout this video later. The RPMs on my unit for a serve test clocked in at 2014, which is a good number, but one thing I'll note is that I think on large swings, when you can get the ball to sink into the face, you can get pretty good spin. However, on shorter strokes like roll volleys or dinks, I did find it harder to generate spin than other paddles on the market. But again, we'll cover that more a little bit later. Lastly, I did have an x-ray done of my Hyper, and one thing that I thought was fascinating was the layout of the internal rib structure was the same as the Ultimate Elongated. I was anticipating a wider rib structure to fill out more of the wide body shape. I did ask Raphael, the owner and engineer of Gearbox, about this, and he said he doesn't need to expand the structure to maximize the sweet spot and can instead do that through other methods. Now, Raphael is obviously much smarter than I will ever be, so there's no world where I can pretend to have a better idea of how to improve his paddle. But I just found it fascinating that it was still so narrow on a wider paddle. But anyways, those are all of the specs. Now we need to talk about the break-in period of this paddle. I think that reviewing Gearbox paddles might be in my top 3 most annoying paddles to review. The primary reason for this is that it's well established that these newer Gearbox paddles have a break-in period where the paddle changes quite a bit, and the trend is usually that the paddle gets hotter and hotter. How fast this change happens will depend on how hard the player hits and how often they're playing. If you are primarily a soft game player, it may take considerably longer to achieve the full break-in. The reason this is annoying is because for the first week of hitting this paddle, the thoughts you collect about it are borderline useless, because in 2 weeks, the paddle may play noticeably different. And this was perfectly illustrated to me while reviewing this Pro Ultimate Hyper. They sent me 2 units, one that I could use for all my testing, and then the second one was used as a reference point to gauge how the break-in was coming along. I would say for my first 4 to 5 sessions with the paddle, I was extremely underwhelmed with it. The sweet spot felt tighter than I would have expected, the paddle felt very dense and soft, and it had the perception that it lacked power. Part of the reason I say perception is it does hit objectively hard when we ran a radar gun serve test, and we were getting about 57.2 miles per hour on average. And other paddles like the Scorpius 3S 14mm and Paddletech ESQC 12.7mm were 57.4 and 56.7 miles per hour respectively. But I found initially when using this paddle that it didn't feel very powerful, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First, when you miss center, you lose so much power, at least before the break-in's complete. So consistently achieving that power was difficult. Of course, missing the center on any paddle is going to result in a lack of power. However, some paddles are better at performing consistently when you miss more out of the center than others. But I found I could consistently generate equal or better power on the 3S and Paddletech even when missing the sweet spot slightly. Second, I also think due to the more muted sound and feel of the paddle, you don't get the perception that the paddle is as aggressive as, say, a Paddletech ESQC 12.7mm, which is historically a very loud sounding paddle. The sound in particular, I think, is a big reason for the perception of it not feeling like it hits as hard. So if you do pick one of these up, make sure you keep that in mind. Now back to those first few sessions. I kept wanting to put this paddle down. It felt like a hindrance to my play and really wasn't that enjoyable. The way I viewed it out of the box is that I had a harder to swing than normal standard shaped paddle that was less forgiving on off-center shots and consistently felt less powerful than its competitors when you would miss that center. There really wasn't anything about the Hyper that I felt like I was gaining relative to its competitors. You guys know that stick figure meme where he's poking an item and saying, "Do something"? That's exactly how I felt when using the Hyper initially. I was just waiting for a break-in to see how different the paddle was going to be because I knew it was going to happen eventually. So it was just kind of frustrating having to wait for it because it feels like I wasn't getting to appreciate what the paddle was actually supposed to be. So now that I've given you my thoughts pre-break-in, let me give you my thoughts post-break-in. After about the 7th or so session with the paddle, it finally started to feel a little bit looser. It's really hard to explain, but when the paddle's brand new, all the components feel really tight. As it gets used more, everything starts to feel a little looser and relaxed. There starts to become more of a spring feel from the paddle rather than a really dense and soft feel. The best way I can think to describe it is if you had a trampoline, but the tension was pulled really tight and doesn't allow for much spring. As it breaks in, it's like that tension loosens up and there's more give around the entire paddle. This led to the sweet spot starting to feel a lot better. During the initial break-in, I had placed lead at 3 and 9 and also a strip at the head of the paddle, and once it reached what I considered to be well broken in, I was able to take the lead off, and I think the paddle played better than any of the pre-break-in with the lead attached to the paddle. The sweet spot no longer felt like a massive drop-off when you barely missed, and it didn't feel as dead around the paddle. And there was much more of a spring in the face of the paddle, which resulted in more pop and power. So all of that to say, you really need to give this paddle time to break in, and I can't emphasize enough how much I didn't like the paddle before the break-in, and on one specific day, it's like the paddle just decided to finally loosen up, and a bunch of the playability increased because of it. Power went up, pop went up, and the sweet spot got larger, and that's even without the lead on it. Another thing I observed is that the sound of the paddle changed. When it's new, it's quieter, lower pitched, but as it gets used more, it starts to sound louder and a slightly higher pitched tone, which you can listen to here. I'm around 2 weeks of use on this paddle now, and it's unclear to me when or where this break-in period is going to stop. I have to imagine that if a really heavy hitter used this paddle for 3+ months, that it would feel even looser than what I'm using right now. I actually got to watch John Q play at Worlds against a very, very broken in Pro Ultimate Elongated, and I could not believe how hard this guy was hitting the ball. The entire match, I actually thought he was using a Pro Power Elongated, and then I realized it was actually an Ultimate. So that to me makes it feel like this paddle may break in a little bit more if you are a heavy enough hitter. And I think that's what makes reviewing a Gearbox paddle difficult. With no clear end in sight for break-in, how do you clearly articulate to someone what the paddle really is? I wouldn't be surprised if you guys see a decent amount of variance in opinions of this paddle online, because their opinion is going to heavily depend on how long that paddle was used. Someone might love it when it's brand new and hate it when it loosens up. Another person, like myself, may dislike it when it's new, and then as it breaks in, they prefer it. But now that I've given you my experience of pre and post break-in, I'm going to explain the overall playability after about 2 weeks of use on this paddle. Post break-in, I did play this paddle stock for several sessions, but I did eventually land on putting about 4 inches of tungsten tape at the bottom corners just for some extra stability. I found that this made the Hyper feel more solid on contact and obviously more stable. The stats of my paddle went from 8 ounces to 8.4 ounces for static weight. It went from a 113 swing weight to 114, and then the twist weight went up from 6.32 all the way to 7.13. One of the things I've noticed is that there is a small disparity in the pop and power, similar to the Vatic Pro Saga, where on drives it hits hard, but there's less pop in comparison to other similar power paddles. Now, just to be clear, it's not nearly as drastic as the gap in pop and power on the Vatic Pro Saga, but it does remind me of that, where there's a little bit of a bigger gap than normal. I think this is nice in the sense that if you swing bigger, you get more out of the paddle, but on short movements like resets or dinks, it isn't going to get you in complete trouble. I find that usually it's the pop levels of a paddle that make it harder for someone to control. So having a slightly higher than normal gap between pop and power on this one makes it a little easier to use when compared to some of the other power paddles, in my opinion. But just to be clear, this paddle is not completely lacking in pop. I still think it's an aggressive paddle overall, but if you put it up against a mod or a 3S or even a Paddletech ESQC 12.7mm, I think the power and pop gap on the Ultimate Hyper is larger, which will probably make it easier for most people to use. This made things like resets in transition and drops feel smoother, but when I needed to transition and put a ball away or attack something higher, I had the offense to do it. I think for most people, this balance between power and pop is probably better for their game overall. The second thing I appreciate is the sweet spot post break-in. While I still don't believe this competes with paddles like a Volair Mach 2 Forza for stability and sweet spot size, I do think that after the break-in, this is by far Gearbox's best sweet spot, and for a power paddle, it's in a pretty good range as well. I still think the Yola 3S models are the best sweet spot to power ratio on the market right now, but given that the Hyper is an edgeless paddle, I think the sweet spot is pretty good. The third thing that is more of a neutral for me, but I think a lot of people would enjoy, is how muted this paddle is. It has to be in the top 3 paddles with the least amount of vibrations I have felt. If you are really sensitive to vibration feelings, I think this does a great job mitigating that. Now, there are a few things that I wasn't super thrilled about with the paddle. While in a serve test, the Hyper does get pretty good spin, during many of my games, I didn't feel like I could shape the ball as well as I would have hoped, which I find interesting because the ball feels like it dwells longer on the Gearbox. There are a few things this could be. First, Gearbox paddles have always felt smoother to the touch in terms of how much grit they have. Second, it could just be that I would need to adjust my swing mechanics in order to take advantage of the paddle better. On really large swings, it felt okay to shape the ball, but things at the net felt like I wasn't quite getting the grab I would have hoped on dinks and roll volleys. I'm not someone who's abusing spin on the court, so I wouldn't call it a huge complaint for myself personally, but I could see this frustrating some players out there. Second, I don't usually tend to love paddles that have this non-linear style of power. Paddles like a mod or a Gearbox Pro Power Elongated, or even something like a Diadem Vice, hit in a way that when hitting softer, it doesn't hit as hard, but the more you can accelerate and give the paddle, the more you get out of it at more of an exponential rate. A Paddletech ESQC is what I would consider linear, where you know exactly what you're getting all of the time. On the Gearbox, I found myself myself questioning how hard I should swing on certain shots, which made me feel a little bit less confident. Particularly on returns, I never found a super comfortable swing pattern to get the ball consistently deep without sailing it long. So this usually meant I was underswinging and giving shorter returns than I would have preferred. Now, to be clear, this is more of a me issue than a paddle issue, but if you understand the experience I'm describing and know you don't like that in a paddle, then be warned that the Hyper does tend to play a little bit like that. Third, which I'm sure everyone watching this review saw this one coming, I hate that the break-in is a thing on this paddle. I think it's generally bad for the industry in almost every single regard. For some paddles on the market, like a mod TA15, the paddle is literally breaking and the core is going out of spec. With paddles like the Gearbox, it's unclear if something is literally becoming damaged on the inside, but regardless of if it is literally broken or not, I think the paddle changing over time gives the consumer a product that they don't know how it will perform from day one versus month 3. And it also makes it a lot harder as a reviewer to articulate to you, the consumer, what to expect. And you as the consumer may like the paddle one way, and then it turns into something later on that you might not like. Now look, I don't expect a paddle to have absolutely zero change, but when the change is the paddle getting hotter and hotter over time, I think that's just bad for the industry, and we probably need to see that go away. If it's going to be a thing that is here to stay, then that break-in needs to be very consistent and very predictable from paddle to paddle, and not increase in pop and power output by significant margins. Okay, wrapping up this review, I have had a hard time deciding how to rate this paddle. I think it has objectively good traits once broken in, but I don't know if I think they are that much better than, say, a Paddletech ESQC or Yola 3S. If anything, it's more that it may perform similar overall, but you get a different feel out of it. Instead of a Paddletech where it feels like there's little dwell time, is loud and very poppy, you're getting something that is more muted and plush feeling and has a longer dwell time. So rather than being strictly better than other comparable power paddles, it may just provide you with different attributes that may be appealing for certain players. Now, of course, when talking about a 3S, if you do play USAP sanctioned or APP tournaments, that paddle is out of the question, which, if that's you, the Gearbox then might become even more appealing. There's a local tournament in my area that higher levels are competing in, and the 3S was actually not allowed there. So there are definitely still local tournaments that aren't allowing the 3S models. Okay, so who should buy the Ultimate Hyper? I think it's for people who, 1, don't care about break-in periods or that their paddle may change for an undefined amount of time. 2, who really want a paddle that dampens vibrations. 3, for people who are looking for a powerful paddle where the pop level is a little bit below the power level, which may make it easier to control. And then 4, for people who already loved Gearbox paddles and thought the sweet spot was too small, or that the Ultimate Elongated was too hard to swing. If you fall into several of those buckets, there's a good chance you're going to enjoy the Hyper. However, I would say it's not for people who hate break-in periods, want a high value to dollar spent ratio, dislike head-heavy paddles, and while I don't think the Hyper is difficult to swing like the Ultimate Elongated, I do think it's harder to swing than a Paddletech ESQC, and for people who are looking for a very fast and low balance or swing weight paddles, this may not fit that bill perfectly. 4, if you want the response of your paddle to feel very linear and predictable on every shot, then the Hyper probably isn't going to be for you. And the 5th and final reason is if you already own a ESQ 12.7mm or Scorpius 3S. If you own one of those, I don't think I'd encourage you to purchase the Hyper. I think if anything, you're looking at a lateral upgrade where you change certain aspects rather than getting a strict upgrade. What you will likely get is giving up one attribute and then replacing it with another. In my opinion, the 3S 14mm is one of the best power standard shape paddles you can buy right now if you don't play USAP sanctioned tournaments. If you do own one of those paddles, then I would highly recommend that you demo a Hyper before you make the full commitment. So in summary, I think this is Gearbox's best paddle to date. However, because of the toned down power with new regulations coming and the higher balance point, I do think the gap between a Gearbox and other power paddles has narrowed, and the reason to pick a Gearbox is a bit smaller than it was when the Pro Power came out. Because the Pro Power had such a huge gap in terms of power that it was like, well, if you want this much power, then you have to pick this. Now with the Ultimate, that gap has closed to be closer to other similar power paddles, which frankly, this model is in my opinion much better for amateurs. Once a pro power hit max break-in, it was so hard to reset or keep the ball in the court. Now you have much more balanced characteristics that contribute to making the playability of the Hyper much better rather than just chasing pure power. So yes, it's a good paddle and I enjoyed it once broken in, but there were definitely some frustrations along the way. But thanks for watching and I'll catch you guys in the next video.